scholarly level Reformed guys who also are easy to understand, okay? So I would highly recommend to you that if you were to shore up your own understanding of Reformed doctrine and Presbyterian practice, that's the correct way to use those words. Don't use Reformed doctrine and practice. It's Presbyterian practice, okay? Those are much more consistent with the historical development of the most biblically consistent understanding of belief and life, okay? So I'd recommend to you first and foremost Sinclair Ferguson. By the way, on Ligonier, he has a daily 5-minute devotional that they're putting out that's well worth plugging into. Every morning he puts out some new thing. So some years ago, I was finishing up a course at Reformation Bible College. They called it Ligonier Academy of Biblical and Theological Studies because it was the doctorate, and okay, fine. But it was really Ligonier Reformation Bible College. And he, for a brief period of time, had served as the dean of the program, and he was one of my seminary, my MAR professors at Westminster, and I had the blessings of being able to meet with him privately for one course, and so knew him, he knows me, blah 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 blah. So he spoke at their chapel for the college while I was down there, and we attended. Us D-Min students, we attended, and they were selling a new book of his at the time. So I picked up a copy and went up to him afterwards. I've never done this before. And I said, would you do me a favor? He said, sure, Reed, sign it, address it to my wife, Addie. And as he was doing it, I said to him, she has found your book so helpful in her understanding of what the Bible teaches. And he responded with this, oh, Reed, thank you so much. That is the primary reason why I write books. And to hear that that's actually what's being blessed in people's lives is very encouraging to me. And so that was really cool, So I would recommend him, okay? He's going to give you real good grip on belief and practice. But then you also need to really learn how to read the Bible so that these things that are there pop out, okay? I'm convinced much of our confusion for many of us is because we've been exposed to deficient paradigms. For example, I'm about finished working through the deficient paradigm that the Mosaic law is a republication in some manner of the covenant of works. I'm about working through the arguments. There's a heritage of deep argumentation going all the way back to the beginning of the Reformation era. So it's not something that is we should just easily brush off. We should respect and work through it. But I'm almost there. I don't believe in republication. I think it's a misnomer. But be that as it may, the reason why that's changed for me is because as I keep reading Scripture, that system of explaining what the Bible teaches just seems to leave yeah buts. Now remember, I came out of dispensationalism. I had studied it quite deeply at the theological level. And it's just nothing but yeah buts. And you're building bridges. I don't know if you've seen this little app. They've got this app out. It's a game where you have to build bridges, and they give you a certain amount of support pieces, and you have to build a bridge over the gap that's there. And if you build it right, the bridge stabilizes, your people get across, and you get points. And if you don't, and it's just a silly, stupid little thumb thing, right? But it is fascinating to me how dispensationalism is basically building bridges in the air. I mean, the only way it works is if you're on a different planet where, you can build castles in the clouds. The gravity doesn't work the way you think it does or something. It's just mind-boggling, all right? Well, as you're moving into Reformed doctrine, you're going to find the same thing. And you're going to have confusion of your past. I get that, okay? But it's going to work out the more you study folks who are teaching you biblically consistent ways of reading the Bible. And one person I have found to be extremely consistent from the very first book I've ever read of his, and you could pray for him. He's fighting old age, doing well, I will add, but he wants to finish putting out substantial books on every section of the Bible. How to read this in the Bible, how to read this section of the Bible, how to read this section of the Bible. And he's close. If any of you are familiar, he published last fall his series, his book on how to read the Gospels. All right, and I'm giving it a subtitle that's not on there, but that's his point. All right, many of you know him by the very first book, which he got famous for, The Christ of the Covenants, O. Palmer Robertson. And so I got in the mail yesterday, and someone forgot to give it to me. So I managed to find it this morning. I said I'd bring it and show it to you. This is O. Palmer Robertson's The Flow of the Psalms. Now, I would suggest to you that the purpose of the Psalms is not merely to give you a theology that, this is 2015, which is odd. I'd never heard of it before. Is not necessarily to give you scripture songs so that you can sing them in church. Okay? It serves that purpose. Okay? But the purpose of the Psalms is to connect at the deepest level possible the doctrine of the Bible with your personal experience in life. The Psalms are intended as the Bible's own personal devotion book. Every single bit of it. And in this book, he does a really good job of using the historic structuring of the Psalms. We think that it was done in the Ezra period. And by the way, during the 400 years between Malachi and the New Testament, there was quote-unquote silence. That's because the Spirit was working through gifted men who were editing and arranging with more clarity the Old Testament books. Okay? That was all under the inspiration of the Spirit. So don't think that, they edited the Old Testament. Don't listen to people who tell you that. They're dummies. They haven't thought through the process. Okay? All right? And this is as a reforming dummy, I say that. So, And the book of Psalms then is structured as something to really mature you. I like his outline here. He offers this as an outline. So the first book, that's Psalms 141, would be confrontation, right? The problems of life, being confronted with sin and sinners, right? Book 2, 42 through 72, communication. Book 3, 73 through 89, devastation. Book 4, 90 through 106, maturation. And then Book 5, 107 to 150, consummation. In other words, the whole structuring of the Psalms is intended to move you towards maturing in your faith. And that is actually quite encouraging. So, as helpful guides to how to read the Bible, of course you could read Table Talk. I've had people who, years, right, in their 60s and 70s, I just don't understand the Bible. What do I do? Get Table Talk, read it every day, read the articles that are provided in it, stick with it for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, you will have had enough exposure to the basic nomenclature, right? The terms and language. What are you smiling at? Okay. The terms, the phrases, the structuring, okay? You'll be exposed to all of that at a deep level. And you will at least recognize what people are talking about. Okay? So there's a simple little trick if you're like, okay, I'm telling you, 2 years, okay? You begin the first year going, 90% of this, I don't understand what they're talking about. I feel like a dummy. The answer is, it's exposure, it's not dummy, okay? You just need exposure. You'll eventually learn how to read it, okay? That's how I ended up understanding free market economics. Spent 3 years reading their books, right? And all of a sudden I'm like, hey, I understand now, right? Okay, so that's a rather strong recommendation. You know, one of my goals is to disciple you guys well. And we live in a resource-rich era, which has its own dangers. And so I really wanted to prioritize particular things that you should give attention, all right, to which you should give attention. Sorry, I've had to work on my grammar. It's okay to say which you should give attention to, unless you're writing it. So I'm working to stop talking that way too. All right, so here we are. We're exploring the what's wise and wherefores of Reformed theology. We've spent about 4 weeks, 3 weeks, I forget now, on the principles, okay? We've reviewed the purpose, the goal, and the outlines, and we've reviewed what is worship, biblical foundations for worship, okay? And so we're done the preliminary principles. We're now going to go into worship history. We really only have 3 things to review, and I think I might be able to get this done today, even with the late start. So we'll see, okay? So we begin with this premise that worship is essential to all mankind. And what we mean by that is, imagine a human being without a thumb. Well, he's a deficient human being, physically deficient. He's missing a piece, but he's still a human being, okay? Imagine a human being who has the DNA exclusively of a monkey. Well, he's not a human being. Okay, he's a monkey. All right? So there's a differentiation. You follow what I'm saying? So when we say something is essential, what we're meaning is that it must be present, or we're not talking about a human being. That's what we mean. Okay? If I say a gas-powered car, okay, and it has a combination of gas and electric, is it a gas-powered car? Technically, it's a gas-powered car. It has a hybrid, that's the term we've been using for it, but if I said, this is a gas-powered car, now make sure you only find electric charging stations or you won't go very far. Okay? So that's not a gas-powered car. You follow what I'm saying? Okay, when I say something is essential here, I'm saying you can't have a human being without having this characteristic. Are you with me? Okay? The scripture uses as evidence of this, okay, of what we might call an argument to the opposite. Why in the world do unbelievers insist on worshiping? I saw a brief little survey today. People who self-identify as atheists, what percentage of them insist that there is no such thing as a higher being of any sort? You would think if they self-identify as an atheist, it'd be 100%, right? No, it's 60%. And I would suggest that that's even being gracious, okay? Because most people you talk to who say, I'm an atheist, they really are just militaristic, right? They've had a bad experience with the church somewhere, is sadly what it means. And often they had a bad experience with the church, we understand, okay? Not always, but often, all right? So even atheists, do they express worship? I remember a former member of our church all the time, he says, it always fascinates me people who get up in arms, who manage to protest and argue there are no such thing as unicorns. If there's no such thing as unicorns, why do you get up and protest against the non-existent? And he was making a point towards atheists. Why scream and holler? There's no such thing as God. If there's no such thing as God, why not just belittle those who believe in him and move on? Okay? By the way, the best atheist arguers, that's actually what they do. So some people try to be consistent. All right, but Romans 1 is demonstrating, it's an argument from the opposite. Even unbelievers demonstrate by nature. They're trying to appease. That's what worship boils down to. They're trying to satisfy an innate inner drive. Okay? Show me a dog who's learned to meow. You can't. Show me a cat who's learned to bark. You can't. They can imitate. But if you sit there and listen to the sounds and compare them to the real thing, you're like, no. You know that's not true. It's of their nature. Okay? It's of human nature to worship. Are there any questions here? Wow. Just kidding. I can tell. It's one of those screams where you're like, oh, someone bumped their head on the floor. Whew. Man, take a breath, kid. Take a breath. Please take a breath. It's all right, Hayden. You don't have to leave.
So is it fair to say that all people worship something?
Yes. It's fair to push it even further. All people must necessarily worship something, or they will go insane. Okay? Garrett?
Did you say there's such a thing as self-worship?
Well, that is at the core of all pagan versions, whether it's a formal version like another religion, okay, or it's the atheist. I mean, if you just look at what goes along with atheism, it's called libertarianism, okay? The drive to fulfill the self what? The drive to fulfill my sense of, the Bible would say, your broken significance that you have as a creation of God, okay? And so, yeah, and then you root that in the garden. Does that make sense? You will be like God. Well, if you're like God, what do you deserve? Worship. And if you have a capacity to worship and you refuse to worship God, what do you do with that need to worship? You have to direct it elsewhere. All right? Well, why is it all fundamentally based on self? Well, because all forms of worship now have to deal with the fact that somehow you are left with a memory, an echo, that you are not your own creator. And you're going to have to answer to him. Okay? You're without excuse. And so all worship becomes a form of appeasement. Okay? You can lie to yourself and say, I do these things in order to get, rewards. Okay? I mean, that's Greek mythology, Roman mythology at its best, right? But the reality is that the opposite is always there. And it's a sad reflection of the covenant of works. If you do this, you get this. If you don't do that, you get this. Does that make sense? And so, as always, based on the source, Satan, deception, a counterfeit, very close to the true thing, but just a fraction of a degree off, right? All worship that is not grounded in the person and work of Christ is self-worship. Does that help? And we could probably go on and develop this even further, but yeah, that's a very real conclusion. All right? Okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so here's your overview. You've got 3 big periods in the history of church worship. All right? Pre-New Testament, early church, and medieval to modern church. And because of our context, you're going to see in that modern period, we're going to shift to looking only at our heritage. We're not going to worry about the heritage of the rest of the world, right? Which is fine because it's Western heritage that is becoming the dominant source of heritage for the rest of the world that we would consider third world. or if you want to use another phrase, the 1040 window, right? You'll see. You'll see. Yeah. This is not real clean and easy because there's different strains. Okay? All right. So pre-New Testament, 2000 BC to 70 AD. So I really do like some of Answers in Genesis' efforts on timelining. Okay? It's reasonable to say that Noah and family came out of the flood 2500 to 2400 BC. Okay? And it's reasonable to say the Tower of Babel happened 2300, 2200 BC. And then you've got Abraham, a family that stayed in the area. As best we can tell, there were 5 cities in the southern Babylonian Euphrates area that basically they kind of all work together. Well, we'll make sure we get the food. We make sure we provide the workers. We make sure we get the mud. We make sure we get the irrigation. And, I mean, everyone had specialties, and they all came together to create a tower that symbolized the success of their culture, their blessing by the gods. There is most likely some legendary connections to the stories of Gilgamesh, right? They're not just surviving the flood kind of thing from Gilgamesh. There's more than that. And they all seem to be connected in here, okay? Nimrod is probably merged in with some of this stuff, okay? So, 2000 BC, there's some sort of remembrance of what, if we're looking at it, all right, Abraham is the 10th generation, okay? Now, stretch out those generations, you've got a long time, all right? Use today's reasonable definition. That seems to be relatively consistent, follow at the Mosaic period. Every 25 years you become an adult, you start having a new family. Best way to understand a generation is from birth until you now are mature enough in that culture to be married and support your own family, women and men, okay? So about 25 years. You can expand it to 30 years. Does that make sense? By the way, modern sociological definitions in the West have shifted. They're based on a reduction that grows out of the internet and smartphones. The amount of communication, the amount of influence, okay? I would keep your children, by the way, smart-free phone ignorant until at least graduation from high school. All right? I understand the need for some sort of communication, but the amount of danger on a smartphone they've been able to demonstrate widely and deeply is very, very serious. So these are reports coming out of secular sources at this point, guys. So I understand that sounds radical. It sounds fundamentalist. I get all of that. Okay? So don't get too uptight. I see Elizabeth's eyeballs over here about ready to pop out of her skull. So I get it, honey. All right? All right? All right. So we're going to look at the pre-New Testament period first. Here's a basic breakdown of it. And you can see this modeled in the scriptures. We would call it family altar worship, the head of the family, okay? And this would be what we might call granddad, great-granddad, okay? For some of us, it might be an uncle or great-uncle, right? But that's the family we identify with. It's right before it becomes a clan, okay? Granddad dies, and the 5 brothers, they now are each granddads. What do? Well, you maintain same sort of unity, but there's different patriarchs. You got 5 different patriarchs now. Well, what do? Well, you form a clan. Okay, well, what happens when those clans get too big? Well, then each one becomes a tribe. What happens when you get too many of those tribes together? Well, then they become a Old Testament nation. All right? So those really are related. But notice that worship here, 1450 BC, is the round number for Moses in the wilderness. Okay? You still have pagan worship going on. Think golden calves, all right? Which was a syncretized form of worship learned not merely from the Egyptians. In fact, it's probably reasonable to say not really Egyptian at all. It's probably pre-Egypt Canaanite fertility worship under the name of older versions of Baal. Baal was known as an agricultural god at his most rudimentary sources. Okay, he's the guy who provides the rain, who then pushes the seed down into the dirt. Well, what's that all about? Well, that's a picture of impregnation. And the earth, well, that's the imagery of Asherah. She's the one that receives the impregnating seed that then sprouts into new life. Okay? Very original, core, pagan worship system. Found everywhere. Okay? So then you have the tabernacle of worship, and that goes to 941 BC. Anyone know why 941 BC? Because that's when Solomon built the first temple. Okay? All right, and that's actually a very hard date. When we talk about biblical timeline stuff, people are going to still argue about it, but we can actually, from exterior sources, exterior to the Bible, we can actually at that point go, what date corresponds with the dating and the culture around us? And 941 BC, all right, the reign of Solomon, okay, is a hard and fast date. It's easy to nail that one down tight, okay? From then on down. So you have temple worship, why 586 BC? There we go. Here we go. Yeah, the destruction of the temple, okay? Now, what do you do if you're no longer living in the land? You cannot do the 3-year visits to give their routine sacrifices. You can't even go get free will sacrifices. You can't participate in the cultural community sacrifices that, may have happened monthly. You can't participate in the family sacrifices. A good Jewish family never ate any meat unless it was sacrificed in a local town by the local Levite on a earth, all right, based altar, right? Talk about grilling surfaces, right? Graham.
So, in the period, you have number 4, Old Testament town worship.
That's what I'm going to now.
So they weren't always constantly going to the temple. That was what you said, every 3 years?
Yeah, 3 times a year, all men were supposed to, all males were supposed to show up. And of course, they're supposed to bring their wives and their children.
What was going on, like, in other places in between those periods?
Yeah, that would be Old Testament, all right?
So it was happening even while the temple was there.
I'm gonna, yeah. Old Testament tabernacle and temple worship, there's kind of an assumption that family worship is going to continue. Okay? Now, what does family worship look like? This is where you look at the Mosaic Law and say, don't build an altar out of cut and hewn stones. Okay? Build an altar out of whatever natural stones you have there. Okay, well, why? The tabernacle, we take all our sacrifices there. No. The people who lived near wherever the tabernacle was, okay, they would take all their meat to be sacrificed there before they take it home to eat it, right? This is why Eli's sons, remember Eli? Samuel was raised by Eli. Eli's the one that got too fat, fell over, broke his neck when the Ark of the Covenant was seized, right? Eli's sons are busy doing 2 things wrong. One, they're fooling around with the women whose job it was, the chambermaids, we might say, to clean up the tabernacle. Okay? I mean, you imagine I'm at a butcher shop on a large scale, okay? Imagine an abattoir and a butcher shop, the place they kill the meat, the animals, and then the place they harvest the animals, okay? It's a lot of work, right? They were forcing those women into providing other services, Okay, I'm being euphemistic here. I hope you're getting it. All right. And they were also violating the what was supposed to happen to certain pieces of meat. You're supposed to boil that piece of meat, and then you can sacrifice it, quick burn, and then give the priest his portion. Right? Nope. I don't want it boiled. Yeah, put in the meat hook to pull it out. Okay? And, on the one hand, from, a purely grilling perspective, I understand why they didn't want it boiled. Okay? On the other hand, they're violating God's commands, right? Well, what about people who didn't live near the temple? I mean, there were provisions for when you went to the temple, you lived too far away, bring money, buy a sacrifice there, okay? And the other things you're going to need for the feast, you can include up to and including what we would say strong drink is. Right? Strong drink is stronger alcoholic drink. It might not be the best Irish whiskey you're ever going to get, or Scotch whiskey you're going to get, or Kentucky bourbon you're ever going to get, okay? But it is going to be really good wine. Pretty potent, right? So, well, what about when they weren't going? This is going to your question, Graham. Well, it was family altar stuff. What would happen in every village, there's supposed to be a presence of Levites, okay? They're like the pastor of the town. Right? And everyone is supposed to bring their meat that they're going to be eating to be sacrificed. Where? Well, on that stone altar that was made from uncut rocks. Does that make sense? And they were just going to sacrifice the meat there to Yahweh as an expression of faith, providing for their ordinary resources. That's why you've got rules there about what happens if you find an animal that's been killed in the wild and not, eaten. Basically, we would call it roadkill. All right? What do you do with them? All right? Well, these are all controlled under the practice of family worship. Now, proof of what I'm saying goes back to the constant repeated high place problems. What would happen is that they would take a hill outside of the nearest village, okay, and they would put the altar on the top of the hill. Now, you need a little shade up there, right? And in this climate, what grows the easiest there? Certain types of cedars, evergreens. And then what ends up happening? Well, the pagans, they turn the evergreen, remember syncretism, they turn the evergreens into Asherah poles, okay? And if you're trying to figure out what an Asherah pole looks like, I'm going to be polite and not go into detail here. Just imagine the dance pole, okay? That's a polite version of an Asherah pole, okay? All involved with sexual immorality, right? And so the high green places become practices of syncretism, Graham, mixture of pagan worship with the family altar worship. Does that help? Addie?
Should they have not made the altars on the high?
No, the problem is not that it was made on a mountain. Okay? Right. Remember, now look at the Tower of Babel. Okay? We're going to reach to heaven. Okay? We're going to make a mountain and use that to get to heaven. Okay? The problem is not that. The problem is that in rebellion to God's commands. There's only one mountain in the old Mosaic covenant that you're supposed to worship on. Mount Zion. Okay? In Jerusalem. It's the only place. Okay? Well, what about all these others? Well, you can put it on a high place. You can put some shade up, But watch the human heart. What are we going to do with it? We're going to paganize it because our hearts are idol factories. This again comes back to our generation about why are we such sticklers for the regulated principle of worship? Because we do that. Okay? This room here, okay, is an example of what's called, it might be best described as the inheritance of Southern colonial Puritan plain. You see versions of this in New England with they tend to have the oldest worship sanctuaries in America, okay? And they're unadorned rooms. There's a great scene at the beginning of the movie Cromwell with Richard Harris. I urge all of you to see it from a historical perspective. Okay? Cromwell comes in, and he's an elder in the church, and they're nonconformists. We would say they're Reformed Baptist. Okay? And he walks in, and he sees the altar. They have restored the crucifix and the candles. And he freaks out. He goes up there and he slams it all against the wall and he starts cursing and, completely unbecoming of a believer, right? Except for the fact that, zeal for thy house. Phineas, who stabbed the prince of Simeon through the Midianite Moabite princess who was underneath of him at the time. That stopped the plague that was getting ready to wipe out Israel right before they came into the promised land. So some of you are sitting there going, what are you talking about? Oh boy. Bibles, my goodness. It's a great book. It tells you the truth about human history. All right, so that helps. So now in town worship, Graham, all right, what we've got now is we've got the remnant of the temple practices. Anyone give me a biblical passage that tells me that this was present? Okay, so now you have to think about Bible books that are written during the captivity. There's a huge one. Huge practice. Daniel praying in his house. What is he doing? 3 times a day. What's he doing? He's at his window facing towards Jerusalem. You see that in pagan practice anywhere today? Pagan worship practice? Where? Islam. 3 times a day facing towards Mecca. There's a substandard where you can pray towards Jerusalem as well because, after all, Muhammad, that's where he supposedly ascended from. That's the Dome of the Rock issue there. Okay? Supposedly the point where Muhammad ascended to heaven. Okay? Talk about Satan taking over territory. All right? But yeah, he's expressing a personal worship without having the temple. Does that make sense? So what would they do? Well, did they have Levites with them? Yeah. Well, what would those Levites do? Well, on Saturday they'd have yeshiva. What's that? Well, that's Jewish school, right? Where you teach mostly the boys, sorry ladies, but you teach the boys, age 13 is when they have to be able to give the Shema. They basically, simplified versions, they'd have to memorize a section of Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Okay? But in other versions, they'd at least memorize the whole book of Deuteronomy. Okay? And so, town worship. And now you could see how this develops into a bit of, well, we can't really do the practices, but we can push the core doctrines of interpersonal relationships, ethical behavior, into people's lives. Do you see how that becomes dominant? You can't do all the religious practices. You can do the ethical behaviors that are supposed to be a part of living by the 10 commandments. Maybe we could say it this way. You can't practice the 1st through 4th commandments very well, but you can practice the 6th through the 10th commandments quite well. And that's not necessarily wrong either. Okay? And so, the town worship that's going on becomes captivity worship, right? What we just described. And then you've got Second Temple worship. Now you've got remnants. Now remember, this is where captivity worship is still going on. Okay? Communities thrive in the cities across the Babylon, then the Persian Empire. Jewish communities. And they cover everywhere. When the Greeks come in and take over everything, Jewish communities thrive everywhere there too. All right? And then they get planted all across what we would say is the Western Roman Empire. Small, but potent. Right? If you had how many men, you could have a synagogue? We know this from Paul, right? They gathered in, was it Philippi? Because they didn't have enough men to have a synagogue. You had to have 10 according to the rabbis, okay, to have a synagogue, okay? So we might describe those kind of conditions as Old Testament Book of Church Order practices. Okay, what, Addie?
Synagogue would be like a church.
A synagogue would be the gathering place of believers outside of the temple. Yeah, and the synagogue is it's just Greek, which means a gathering together, the assembled people. Okay, the assembled people of God in this context. Okay, and then it became the assembled people of God as a expression of Jewish Mosaic worship outside of the temple. So you have Second Temple worship attempt, captivity worship is still going on, the town worship factors are still going on, the family altar worships are still going on, some of it more or less pure, okay? More or less pure in terms of doctrine and practices. I mean, if you sit there and think a t-shirt gun in a worship service is completely fine, you probably haven't studied worship very much. It doesn't mean you're a paganizer. Okay? You might be giving in to syncretized worship. Okay? Doesn't mean you're a paganizer. Does that make sense, Addie? No. Do you? No, go ahead.
Temple worship and second temple. What does that mean because of,
Well, Second Temple, remember, the first temple was completely obliterated and torn down.
okay, when was that again?
Well, if you look, that would be 586.
Oh, 586.
Okay? Second Temple would be 515. Okay, they began to start building it, all right? I forget which one of the Old Testament prophets. There's two, Haggai and Zechariah, I think, are focused on reestablishing the temple, finishing it. They started it. They had all sorts of opposition. And this is not the Nehemiah opposition. That comes later, okay? All right, but the same sources. Maybe we say the parents, grandparents of Sanballat and Tobiah, okay? And Second Temple, you got some people who are crying because finally we've got a worship home, okay? And you've got other Old Testament people who are crying because they remember the glory of the first temple and it's nothing like it. Imagine that you lived in imagine you lived in Alabama in one of these multi-million-dollar homes, okay? I say a multi-million-dollar home anywhere else in the country, you're like, big deal, right? Okay, but imagine, it's 10,000 square feet. I mean, it's huge. It's an honest goodness mansion, okay? Imagine it burns down, okay? And you're given it's well put together, but it's a 1,500 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath home. You can appreciate that. I finally have a comfortable place to sit and get cleaned in the morning. Thank goodness. But oh my gosh, look how big it is. There's nothing to it. So that's what's going on there. Okay? And then you have Old Testament, what we might say is Mosaic worship. And that's a culmination of all of this stuff. All right? Temple in town with the remnants of everything else being in there. This is where they're developing the rabbinic beliefs and practices. And the fairest way to describe it is they're struggling to understand their theology, their belief, but they have a really well-developed sense of book or church order. You don't do it that way, do it this way. Well, why not? Well, because of this. Well, then what happens is you end up with people beginning to argue, okay? Well, the rabbi says this, and therefore it's God's advice. It's not pious advice. It's God's command. All of a sudden is what ends up happening. Okay? And then you have New Testament Mosaic worship. Notice it has a hard ending at 70 AD. Okay? And the reason for the 20 BC, anyone know what happened in 20 BC? The first Herod began building something. What was it? Yeah, the third temple. When did it get finished? It got finished in 70 AD. Okay? What happened immediately after they got finished? The local building authorities condemned it. That would be the Romans. All right. Are you tricking? I mean, tracking? I mean, getting what I'm saying here? Okay. They wipe it out. Now, this is where one of those hard splits happens. Okay, you're going to hear me say some things that are going to maybe sound radical to you, and I want you to stop for a second. Okay? So, who got wiped out in the Roman destruction of Judea, not just Jerusalem? Who got wiped out? Did Christian communities get wiped out? No, they were warned to flee. Most of them fled. Okay? Did the Sadducees get wiped out? Not really. They were elites. Okay? But what happened to their money-making system? How did the Sadducees make their money? They made their money off the tax that they received from the money lenders and the temple changers and the guys that sold the sacrifices and everything. That's where they made their resources. Hey, sweetheart. Okay? And they lost their income stream. Now, don't worry. They're elites. They got plenty of other money. They'll figure out how to spin it into something else. Okay? Well, what happened to the Pharisees? The Pharisees are well described as middle-class evangelicals. Okay? Old Testament evangelicals, not New Testament evangelicals. But what happened to them? Most of them managed to either flee or they already had connections to people like Paul's family in Tarsus. They had thriving businesses in the diaspora, it's a term for the spreading. Okay? They're the ones who had thriving communities in Babylon and Susa and Alexandria and Rome. They're the ones that had thriving communities in the areas. Well, Rome and Nero kind of wiped that one out, right? I mean, not completely, but put a big hit on it. You know, it's hard to only focus on Christians when you think the Christians start with the Jews, right? Nero was about persecuting the Christians, right? Well, what happened to the Zealots? They, for the most part, died out. They're the ones who set up Masada, for example, okay? They're the most part died out. So now, what happened to the ability to have a temple worship system? It disappeared. Okay, what happened to the ability to have a, while we're in captivity, worship system? I mean, the Romans really did to the temple and the whole worship system what they did to every other pagan religion they conquered. They salted the ground so much that if it wasn't for other records, you would sit there and wonder, did the Carthaginians really sacrifice babies to Molech? Can't believe that's a debate. It has been until recently. Okay? Are you tracking with me so far? So what happens then is what's now the dominant group of Jewish people who don't follow Jesus? Well, it's the Pharisees. They're the ones who refused to do what Paul did as a Pharisee. Convert. They still have lots of power, earthly power. They run the communities. All right? The Sadducees, if they're going to go live somewhere outside in one of the diaspora communities, they have to cooperate with the Pharisees. They can't make sacrifices. Maybe they can do the family altar, the town practices, but even those are going to be limited because of the, watch this, the dietary aspects of the Mosaic covenant. And so what ends up happening? Well, what ends up happening is, in order to make the practices as consistent with the Mosaic structures, they become ethical applications. And that literally pushes its way into the whole belief system. And so where does the rise of kosher food come from? That's trying to make food consistent with the Mosaic practices without the basis of the Mosaic circumstances. You don't have a temple. You don't have a family altar. You don't have these things. What do?
right? Hit everything with salt. Make sure the guy doing the butchering at least is a rabbi. That's where it comes from, right? So what do you end up with? Is you end up with people whose last name is Levi. Okay? What tribe do you think he's from? That's easy. Okay? Right? By the way, the greatest amount of people who are descendants, at least name-wise, of Levi in the world is located in what country? China. Yeah, the name Lee actually comes from Levi. Fascinating. Okay? So, gosh, I do not take that girl to any football games. I tell you. Okay. You've heard the name Cohen? Kohen? Okay. What do you think their ancestors? What do you think their ancestors did it for a living? No, they were the Kohanes. The Hebrew word for priests. Probably of the family of Aaron. Okay? So yeah, we have all these remnants. I know, thank you, Graham. We have all these remnants that are still around today, but in talking about the worship of the church, it's very important to note that at AD 70, there is a hard split. At AD 70, it's fair to say this. You may have been raised in the Jewish synagogue system, but you must not raise your children or your grandchildren in that system. All the accommodation of Acts chapter 15 are declared null and void. Meat sacrificed to animals, okay, with the blood, all right, no big deal. Because it's just a Mosaic practice that has had a one and done stamp to it by the providence of God in AD 70. So here's a hard heretical one. Any of you ever get told you're going to go to a Seder, a Jewish practice of the last meal? Okay, you are participating. You're going to love this, Carol. I told you. You are participating in a paganized version of the meal from the descendants of those who refused and were in the crowd crying, "Crucify him." They never repented. I've done the study. I can tell you the rabbinic traditions that are in the Seder, we can go back clearly to the 400s. All right? And not as clearly past that. And it all comes in communities where these weren't Jewish people who were Christians who were trying to maintain some sort of messianic approach. All messianic Jewish Christians, okay, the reality is 90% of them are disgruntled Protestant Gentile Christians who think they found a better version of Christianity. And the few who are Jewish, they were never consistent. And if they were consistent, they were participating in a paganized version of the Mosaic practices that had been done away with. Read. Do you I do. Sorry. Being consistent to what the Bible teaches sometimes is hard. Okay? I'll leave it for there. You let that sink in. You ask me any questions next week. We're going to go to early church worship next week. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for this wonderful place to stop, please, God. Let us be growing in kindness and mercy towards all, even where we see things that cause us to say, that's wrong, it's not good for you. Please, God, let us be people who are grateful that Jesus came to us and said gently, that's wrong, you're going to live in hell forever if you keep doing that. Thank you, Jesus, for saving us from these things. Now bless our worship. In Christ's name, amen.